All right, so this next slide, we're going to be talking about different product costs. There are going to be three types of product costs that we're going to be discussing. The first one is direct materials, and we have direct labor, and then we have overhead. So we can call it factory overhead, manufacturing overhead, or just overhead. So these are the three main topics that we're going to be covering, and I'm going over each one of them individually. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the direct costs. So this includes the direct labor and the direct material. So direct labor is the wages and salaries that are separately and readily traced through the manufacturing process to finished goods. So basically, this is the labor, so the workers, what we pay them, their expense, their salary, their wages. It's those who work directly on the product. They're the ones who are actually putting it together. So we can actually tell how much something costs to make. So if something takes an hour to make and I know I pay you $10 an hour, I know in labor it costs me $10. So like I said, these are the people who actually work on the product. So assembly line workers or those putting it together. It wouldn't include management or security or the cleaning staff, just those who actually work on it. So they're direct labor. It's a labor directly related to the product. So the other one was direct materials. Same type of concept. It's the materials directly related to the product. So let's say that we are manufacturing a car. What would the direct materials for that be? So one example would be the tires. We need tires to go on the car. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about overhead. Overhead is basically like a default category for everything else. So if something is not direct labor and not direct material, it's going to go into the overhead. And remember, this is called factory overhead or manufacturing overhead. So the first item would be indirect materials can go in here. So these are materials that maybe don't end up in the finished product. They're not physically part of it, or they're so insignificant that it's hard to even put a cost on what we're spending. So think about, making a car, maybe thread that goes into the seat cushions. That'd be something that's hard to put a cost on. So it's usually just the main things would be the direct materials, the insignificant parts that don't cost a lot or don't end up in the finished product. They would not be considered direct materials. They would be considered indirect. Okay, so indirect labor, same concept. So basically, the direct labor are the employees who work directly on the product themselves. So the indirect labor would be everyone else. It could be management, it could be the security staff, the cleaning crew, anyone else who works for the company but not directly on the product. Okay. And also, like I said, all other costs associated with the factory itself. So what they spend on utilities, so the electricity, the heat, the water, what they spend on rent or insurance, just anything else that is a cost, it's an expense related to the factory would go here into overhead. So, as a summary, we have direct material, direct labor, and then overhead, everything else. Okay, so all manufacturing costs that are not direct material and not direct labor, and that cannot be separately and specifically traced to the goods that we're producing. All right, so another type of cost that companies may have is what's called period costs. Period costs are costs that do not have to do with manufacturing the product. So these are other costs that a business may have, but they have nothing to do with making the actual product. It has to do with selling and administrative type costs. So first we have selling costs. So all the money we're spending, all the expenses we have on selling the product. So let's say we have a manufacturing plant that makes a product, and then we send it to a store that sells the product. So we have the manufacturing costs related to the factory, and then we have selling costs. These would be the period costs related to selling the product. So anything related to the store, the salaries of the people who work there, the rent for the store, the insurance for the store, anything related to the store would be considered a period cost. So just make sure you have these two separated. We have the product costs, direct material, labor, overhead. Period costs, they do not have to do with the factory. So we got selling and also administrative costs. So this would include the accountants, us, right? Lawyers, human resources, just anyone who works in an office outside of the factory itself. So period costs are just other costs a company has that are not related to making the product. Okay, so we're going to be working on the classwork problem, so make sure you have the Word document downloaded so you can follow along as we do this. This is classwork problem number 1. Okay, we have DS Company that produces sporting equipment. Specifically, we're going to be talking about producing footballs here. So we're going to have to identify if the cost would be considered direct material, direct labor, overhead, or a period cost, meaning it has nothing to do with the factory itself. The first one we have is electricity used in the production plant. I always ask myself the question, does it have to do with the factory or not? In this case, electricity used in the production plant, it's definitely being used in the factory. The direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, these ones right here, all have to do with the factory. Okay, so it's going to be one of these 3. Now, is electricity, is that a direct material? No. Is it labor? No. So then by default, everything else will be going into factory overhead. I'm just going to write factory overhead right here. Factory overhead. Okay. Number 2, labor used on football production line. Remember that labor doesn't always have to be direct labor. It depends if you're physically working on the product or not. Also, if it has to do with the factory or not. In this case, it does have to do with the factory because it's the production line. So what do you think it would be? It would be direct labor because you're actually working on the product. DL. Next, number 3, we have sales commissions. This is paying the employees, the ones that work in the store, the commissions for selling the product. Would this be a factory cost? No, because it has nothing to do with the factory. So if it doesn't have anything to do with the factory, it would be a period cost or a period expense. So I'll put PC for period cost. Number 4, depreciation on equipment used to produce footballs. Does this have to do with the factory? Well, it's about producing the footballs. The answer would be yes, it has to do with the factory. Which one would it be? We have direct materials, direct labor, or overhead. Well, depreciation is not a material, it is not labor, so it'll be factory overhead. By default, everything else just goes in there, all other factory expenses. Number 5, salary of the manager who supervises the entire plant. Does it have to do with the factory? Yes, so it's going to be one of these 3. Now, it's a salary, so it would either be direct labor or overhead, but someone who's a manager who supervises everything. Are they directly working on the product? No, managers do a lot of other things. They manage the whole thing, they put out reports, but they're usually not the ones on the front line working for the company. So this would be factory overhead. So please just take a note that managers are not direct labor, they're considered overhead. Okay. Number 6, office manager salary. So we're talking about managers again, but in this case, it's for the office. Does an office have anything to do with producing the footballs? No, right? So it's not a factory cost. This would be a period cost because it has nothing to do with the actual plant, period cost. Number 7, rent on factory building. Does it have to do with the factory? Yes, it has the word factory in it. So we know it's one of these 3. Okay, now it's the rent. Is that a direct material? No. Is that labor? No. Then it would be factory overhead. Delivery expenses. Delivery expenses would be delivering the product to customers. Does this have anything to do with making the product? No, it does not. It has to do with what happens after we make the product. So it would not be any of these product costs. It would be the period cost. Number 9, leather used to produce footballs. Does this have to do with the factory and making it? Yes, it does. So we know it's going to be one of the three product costs. Is it a direct material? Well, it is a material, right? It's leather used to make the footballs. Now, would it be direct or indirect? My question is, if we're making a football, how important is the leather to the product? Imagine a football without the leather. It really wouldn't be a football. This material is directly related to the product and is a major part of it. In this case, it would be direct material. Lastly, we have indirect materials used in making the goods. We know that it's used in making the product. It's going to be a product cost, but it's indirect materials. So it's not going to be the direct one. All indirect costs go to factory overhead. I hope you were able to follow along with this and that you understand all the answers to this.